Thank you all for coming. Today's panel, Happily Ever After. So just to sort of set this up, do you remember when a plot used to go, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back? Well, not anymore. These days, romance is complicated. Marriage is an option or not. And when you're writing romantic fiction, you have to deal with a lot more than that kind of plot. Now, we have 3 books today that deal with the subject of romance, marriage, engagement, etc. And they are anything but formulaic. In one book, the father of the bride lusts after the bridesmaid. In another one, the groom dies at the wedding. And another one, 2 major characters are anti-marriage. So I'm going to be asking, are happy endings obsolete? But first, let me introduce our panel. Seating right to my left is Courtney Sullivan. Her book is The Engagements. Her previous books are Commencement and Maine, which was named Best Book of the Year by Time Magazine, and Washington Post Notable Book for 2011. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. Sitting next to her is Indira Ganesan. And Indira was born in India. She moved to the United States as a child. She graduated from Vassar College. She has an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and her previous novels were The Journey and Inheritance, and she currently lives in Provincetown, Mass. And all the way on the end is Maggie Shipstead. Her book is Seating Arrangements. And Maggie grew up in Orange County, California. Her short fiction has appeared in Tin House, Best American Short Stories, and other publications. She graduated from the Iowa Writers Workshop and is the recipient of the Stegner Fellowship from Stanford University. And Seating Arrangements was the winner of the 2012 Dylan Thomas Prize and the LA Times Prize for First Fiction. And by way of introducing myself, I have been a journalist for the last 30 years. I was with CNN for 24 of those years on both domestic and international stories. I now write international mysteries with exploration themes, and my latest book is The Stolen Chalice. So as that is a setup, I would like to start with the first question, and each of the authors will explain their work in their own words. But the first question is basically the element of chaos. We have all sorts of situations that are around engagement and marriage, and yet that can't be the plot. You have to insert an element of chaos as the catalyst in the story. So let's start with you, Courtney, and just explain your work for a bit.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Oh, thank you. You know microphones better than I'm just the worst with microphones. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Oh no. Okay. Right. How about now?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay, good. Thank you. So my novel, The Engagements, is all about marriage, and I consider myself an expert on this topic, having now been married 6 weeks today. So if you have any questions about the institution or how it works, what marriage is like over time, you can ask me. I wanted to write a novel about marriage over the course of the last century in America, the ways in which it has changed, the ways in which it will never change. And I did this by writing 4 different marriages, each one taking place in a different decade, and each one at a different moment, each one with a certain degree of chaos, as you say, because marriage, of course, is not always a smooth sailing enterprise. And one of the marriages is dealing with infidelity. One of the marriages is dealing with just sort of having young kids, having no money, dealing with the everyday nitty-gritty parts of life. One of the couples is dealing with the fact that they never want to get married, and everyone around them can't quite fathom why. And so I wrote this book about characters who are in the middle of their marriages at some point along the journey, and inserted a 5th character who was a real person named Frances Garrity. She was a copywriter in the 1940s who created the line, "A diamond is forever." And she wrote all of the advertising for De Beers diamonds from the mid-40s through 1970. she herself never married. She was not a very romantic woman in her day-to-day life, but she created this connection, this attachment that we have to diamond rings in America. And the reason that I used diamonds was because they were this aspect of marriage that have stayed so much the same through several decades, but also they're sort of the anti-chaos. You know, the reason that we sort of plan these perfect weddings, although they rarely go perfectly, as you'll hear from these two, you know, and these perfect jewels is sort of, in my mind, a little opposite from the everyday experience of actually being married. So that is sort of the backstory to the engagements.
Indira, a few words on your book?
Well, once I heard, oh, I'm sorry. Did I break the mic?
We can hear you.
Oh, good.
Turn this part.
Oh, this part?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I went to hear the Dalai Lama speak to a great crowd of people in Denver at the Pepsi Center, and someone asked him during the Q&A, you know, what do you do when your child, you know, one's child acts up? How do you react to get them to be more peaceful? And he said, well, I would take a stick and hit them. But he said, why are you asking me? I'm a monk. So, you know, and it's the same situation where I'm not at all an expert in marriage, not having ever been married, but probably the only member in my family, in Indian family, that hasn't been married. As Sweet as Honey is full of marriages, and unlike a lot of books that end with marriages, it begins with one, and in the first few pages, the groom dies, and we have a pregnant bride, and we have very curious children who want to know why this is such a problem, and in the household, and the course of the novel follows this very tall woman's life. Her name is Metterling, and what she'll do with this, you know, with her pregnancy, and how she finds love again, and how arranged marriages, while hers isn't an arranged marriage, how arranged marriage still hovers in the background of the lives of these largely South Asian women. And I have a great deal of fun. I've always wanted to write a book with a happy ending, and I always wanted to write a book that ends, well, okay, I won't say that, but it does. And so...
Spoiler alert there.
Yes, just caught myself, but that's what it is.
Maggie?
Let's see. How am I doing? Okay. Yes, full disclosure, I am also not married, but I thought there was something sort of liberating about that in a way, because there's sort of no husband to offend and no wedding, you know, people who slaved away on my wedding to offend. I did write a short piece that ended up in the New York Times about weddings, and that offended a friend, so all was not lost. But my book, Seating Arrangements, takes place really just over 2 days, leading up to a wedding on an island that's a thinly disguised Nantucket, although people have read it as the Vineyard or as other islands. And it's a sort of waspy family this is the island where they always go, and really the protagonist of the book is the father of the bride, whose name is Win Van Meter, and he is the gentleman who lusts after a bridesmaid that Kitty mentioned. And actually the instigating incident for the book kind of had nothing to do with weddings or marriage. I was in my first semester of grad school, and this was 7 years ago, and a friend called to complain that he'd been riding his bike on Nantucket while wearing tennis whites and swinging a tennis racket, and shockingly was hit by a golf cart and knocked off his bike. He cut his leg, and the man driving the golf cart wouldn't apologize. And I think most people would sort of dismiss that as a moment of rudeness or of awkwardness, but my friend's mind was just kind of blown by the fact that the world had continued to turn, even though this guy hadn't sort of obeyed what he sees as the rules of behavior and of civility that sort of keep us afloat as a society. And so I think he was calling for sympathy, but I was sort of taking notes. And I wrote a short story about this character, Win Van Meter, who is a fairly rigid individual and gets knocked off his bike by a golf cart. And in the short story, he also cooked lobsters, and then he gave his daughter away on her wedding day. And it didn't really work as a short story, and it was suggested to me that it could be a novella. And I felt sort of this sense of possibility, and like I had a lot more to say about this character and a lot more ways to torture him. And a wedding, I think, is an attractive subject for a book. At the time, I didn't really know anything about publishing. I didn't know how... I had no idea how the book would be perceived, but I liked that it was a concentrated group of people, some of whom had long histories together, some of whom were just meeting, all sort of stuck on a house on an island and given lots to drink, and sort of chaos that Kitty was mentioning ensues.
It's a great book. They're all great books. I couldn't put them down. Let me, I have moderator's privilege. I get to ask one question each of our panel, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So Courtney, I just, with all of these plots, because there's four different couples, it's hard to come up with a question for you that can encompass the scope of this incredibly gorgeous, sprawling, incredible novel that has a lot of sociological implications too. But I guess one thing that really stuck out is there was a quote, and it's by your character Gerald, and the quote is, "No one has the right to comment on the way anyone else falls in love." And yet your entire novel is a comment on, how people fall in love. So tell me how you arrived at this decision to depict different types of marriages and engagements and relationships.
Yes, no one has the right to comment on the way anyone falls in love other than me. I can do it. I started thinking about the topic partly in a personal way, because I knew that I would probably be getting married, within the next year or so after I started the book, and that many of my friends were recently married or had been married in recent years, but some of them long enough that you could actually see sort of the path that the marriage was taking. And I was sort of thinking in broader terms, what is it that makes a successful marriage? Is it two people who happen to be a great match and no one changes radically over time? Or is it just the circumstances that befall a couple as they go along? Is there a lot of luck to it? And also because there was such rapid change in the laws around same-sex marriage in the last couple of years, and that conversation has always made it seem as though, on both sides, sort of talking about marriage as this solid thing that hasn't evolved, that just is what it is, and now it's going to change, whether we think that's for good or bad. But in fact, marriage has always changed with every decade. So Evelyn and Gerald in the book in 1972 are dealing with their son getting divorced, and they're just devastated by this because their daughter-in-law is their favorite person on earth, and their son is their least favorite person on earth, and now they're losing their daughter-in-law, and they're losing what they think they're losing their granddaughters. And they also are just, living in 1972 when no-fault divorce is a brand new concept. And I think, we sort of forget it was just a little over 40 years ago that a black man and a white woman couldn't marry in this country, that a woman couldn't have a credit card without her husband's permission. And obviously these societal and legal big picture issues infiltrate the lives of everyday couples. And so that was part of what I was looking at.
It's great. Indira, I absolutely love your groom, Archer, and his description. I'll read it. It's hilarious. Archer bears a striking resemblance to Monopoly Man. He's 4'11". He has a full mustache and a round tummy. And that's the romantic lead as we open this book. All right. Your book is not only about marriage, it's about families, it's about different cultures, it's so much broader than marriage. And your narrator in the beginning is Mina, a 10-year-old who narrates her observations. Why that choice, and how did you arrive at starting so small and then going so big, which I was very, very impressed with?
Mina originally began as a 40-year-old who was at the crossroads of her life, and I had written this enormous, unwieldy chunk of a book about a woman's search for sanity. And I realized as I was writing it that it was incredibly boring. And the only interesting thing was 4 lines about a wedding that the 40-year-old attends, that she remembers attending, which was the wedding of her aunt, Metterling, who is very tall.
I like that part.
That she's tall. Then, it took me a while to recognize I have to throw away the other part, this long novel about a 40-year-old who resembled me, and get to the story of a 10-year-old. And I love the voice of a 10-year-old. I have a niece who's just a little bit older than that. And, they're so frank and they're so honest. My niece, when I read her a little bit of my book, In Progress, she said, well, it's nice, but where's the story? Where's the problem? That's what she said. She said, where's the problem? I said, what do you mean, where's the problem? And she said, well, we always have a problem when we write stories in school, So she was right. There was no problem. It was very distressing. But a child's view is so, it's everything is magic. Metterling is not really that tall, but to them, she's a giantess. And the things that the grown-ups are complaining about doesn't make any sense to them. And I think it just took on from there.
But speak a little bit about the cross-cultural elements of your book, because it's very fascinating about how you show culture changing a little bit as you move through the book.
The book is set, as my other 2 books are, on a fictional island also, of sorts. It's called Pi, and it's a very protected space where I could invent a lot of mythology and geography and history. So it's an amalgamation of a lot of colonial-ruled South Asian countries. And I take the book, the second part takes place in London, and then the third part, the characters return from London and from the United States back to Pi. I guess I followed a change of sorts. What I was really modeling the book on, this is not answering the question, but what I really modeled the book on was Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and how she took a one day in a life to a small passage of incredible change in time, and then she went back to one day 10 years later, and that's what I try to do.
It's a gorgeous book. I guess, Maggie, you have so many characters. I think it even exceeds my family. There are so many characters that have all these quirks and fun aspects and some not so fun aspects, like Aunt Celeste. She's like definitely the aunt in the attic type. And then Wynn has his own stuff. Family it's really about family. It's about marriage and then family broader, which anyone who's attended a marriage knows, or tried to plan a marriage knows. It's about family. It's the marriage part of it is pretty small. Talk to us about, and then as you say, fueled with alcohol on a small island, it's combustible. Talk to me about how you arrived at this fictitious family who are all so very real. And are they based on reality, or did you make half of them up, or have you offended half your family? Tell us a little about that.
No, I sort of protected myself in a way by writing a very Eastern book when I'm in California and my family is mostly Midwestern. So in some ways, there's no way for my family to really mistake themselves for these people. I didn't really spend any time out east until I came out. I went to Harvard, and the adjustment from Orange County to Harvard was a little bit jarring. And I saw people walking around with whales on their pants, and I was like, what do they mean? Like, why are they there? And but I happened to sort of eventually make some very sort of New England friends and families that, have Mayflower ancestors and all these things, and so a lot of my observations that fed the book came from them. But it's been interesting because most of the characters are amalgamations of people I encountered, but there are a couple that are sort of drawn directly. Like there's a character named Maud Duff, and she's always kind of like, it's lovely, it's wonderful about everything. It's sort of overly flowery and full of praise. And she's actually based on someone, but that woman read the book and thought that she was Biddy, the mother of the bride, and was like really certain. So it's been kind of a lesson in the difference between the way we perceive ourselves and the way other people perceive us. And I kind of built the family one by one, and as I was drafting the book, I'd come to a place where I needed something different, and then would sort of, blurp, up came a new character who would fill that role. And but it was sort of an organizational challenge, especially in the book. There's a very long party scene. It's probably 30 or 40 pages, and I had to draw diagrams of where all the characters were and sort of organize them into teams. And actually, To the Lighthouse was one of the books I looked at just for a model of how authors could manage a lot of people in a small space. Other books with party scenes like Wonder Boys by Michael Chabon or Loving by Henry Green. And it was an interesting sort of spatial challenge. But I like having all the generations together and all these sort of crisscrossing relationships.
I have to tell you, my books take place all over the world. There's 5 different locations in each book, and I actually once lost a character in the middle of writing. And where did I leave Cordelia? I just can't remember. I had to look all the way
like
back.
Like the kid in Home Alone.
It was pretty funny. And she's the main character, so it was pretty, you can see how complicated it is. I think we'll open it up to some questions because we have, I'd say, about 20 minutes left. And if everybody's too shy, then I can continue to dominate the discussion. But I would much prefer to have people ask questions. So please, let it go. Your chance to ask anything you like. Go ahead. There's a microphone back there, so everyone can hear you. It's a much better way to go.
Well, I guess this is probably for you, Kitty, but everyone. I kind of wanted to talk about process. And I'm a writer, but I've been writing about multinational companies and decision analytics and stuff that is really boring to most people. And I'm trying to make a transition to do what you've done. And so I guess the 2 questions would be advice for somebody who wants to go from a very technical writing world to writing fiction. And the other is just about your writing processes. And you talked a little bit about how you get started on novels, but any kind of things that stand out for you that would be good for somebody who's just starting out.
That's great. Everybody always wants to know how writers write, which is a really good way to, so I'll kick it off and then we'll pass it down. How do you write? I went from being a journalist, which was nonfiction writing, and I was on a 5:30 p.m. deadline every single day for 24 years. And it was entirely factual. I couldn't put anything subjective in the writing at all. And when I decided to write fiction, it really wasn't to publish it. It was just as a psychic release from the stress of the day. So I basically wanted to create a fantasy world of glamour and romance that at the end of the day, I went into to forget all of the stresses of the newsroom because you see things and you report on things that are very distressing. So I did it completely as escapist fiction that, had adventures, and it was just fantasy, complete fantasy. I found that as I was writing that a lot of people were connecting to that, and that a lot of people have very stressful lives and they want to put their feet up at the end of the day and they want to read something informative but also very relaxing. How I changed style was simple. I just put myself into a new world and made people up and just invented. It was such an opposite from what I was doing every day. I found it quite easy. Courtney?
Well, I've been writing fiction since I was probably about 6 or 7 years old. I always read short stories when I was a kid growing up, and I think, in a way, fiction writing is sort of how I answer the big questions of life for myself. It's not really to begin with something that's already fully formed, but rather to sort of have a question in mind and write to find an answer to it, or at least think on it. I started professionally working in women's magazines and then at the New York Times for 4 years. So I always did other kinds of writing as I was writing fiction, sort of behind the scenes. I wrote my first 2 novels while I still had a full-time job. And I think as far as just the actual sort of discipline that goes along with writing when you are doing something else at the same time, I actually felt that I was better at it then in some ways at just carving out the hours, because when you have a very limited amount of time, you're either going to do it or you're not. You know, I think about people who run marathons, and I'm always just completely amazed by them, and I always think, I should do that, but am I really going to? No, I'm never actually going to, because it just takes the hours. They are willing to commit the hours to that. I was willing to commit the hours to writing every Saturday, you know, and that's kind of what it takes, I think. For me, when I write something like a book review or a personal essay, I could work on it for an hour, take the dog for a walk, and then come back to it, you know, step away. With fiction, I have to sort of really get into that zone of these characters, and so I usually stay there for maybe 6 or 8 hours at a stretch. And not every day allows for that. So I don't write every day. They always say everybody should write every day. I personally do not. But when I do start writing, I stay for a long time. Now, I have some friends who are novelists with children, and when I tell them I need to write for 8 hours in solitude, they sort of laugh and say, well, I write at McDonald's for 40 minutes while my kids are, you know, at ballet class, but that's nice. So it's different for everyone, and you just have to make it work how you make it work.
Indira, your craft, how do you do it?
I used to write every day. I used to write, but only 4 hours a day, and then I thought, okay, that was a full day's work, and that's it. And I was quite happy with that, and I liked it. I liked the routine of it. But then I started to teach, and I just completely plunged into another world of creating syllabi and reading. You know, I always found something else to do. And then finally, when I cut back my hours on teaching and just was teaching part-time, I was able to, find the time being precious again and going back to telling the story. When it's going well, it's so good that you miss it when you stop writing. When you finally, finish the book, you kind of are at a loss because you don't know but to get to that point, you have to really, as Courtney said, you have to really be immersed in it, into the project. But, the other thing that I would do is, in order to get myself back into the habit of writing, I did 3 pages every morning, and I would write awful, awful, awful things. Not only, I would write something like, I don't want to write, and fill 3 pages. But eventually, and this is the Julia Cameron method of writing from the left, the artist's way, where, if you just give yourself that permission to write whatever you want without censoring yourself and do it and create a habit for, of it every day, 3 pages, no matter what, eventually something happens and something breaks through, and suddenly you don't mind what you're writing, but it takes a while.
Maggie?
Well, seating arrangements came from a story that I couldn't quite make work as a story. And then my second novel, which comes out in April, also came from a short story that just didn't quite work. It was like a 30-page story about a ballet dancer. And I had written 100 pages of a novel that I thought would be my second novel. I decided to take a break and just work on revising this story, and it sort of spun out of control and became 90 pages, and then 160 pages, and then 300 pages. And I think some of it was sort of a mental trick, not different from that, where it sort of felt like I was cheating on my real project with this project. And so it was like, oh, fun, like how naughty, I'm working on this novel. And so now I'm starting a third book that I'm intending it to be a novel, so we'll see. It'll probably peter out. I'll write a story. But when I'm really working, I work every day, usually for about 4 hours, sometimes for longer. But I also will go weeks without working at all. And I used to handwrite a lot of my first drafts, and now I don't really have time, so I'll only handwrite when I'm really stuck. And for some reason, it's more difficult to read what you've written. You can just kind of go power through, and then looking back or typing it up as sort of a first revision, I find that can be helpful. And I often work at Starbucks just to get out of the house. I have those big, like, sound-canceling headphones, and I it's also just a way to bribe myself where I'm like, you can have coffee, but you have to work. And even in other places, and like I was in Paris for 3 months last winter, thanks to Stanford has an apartment there, good for them. And people were like, oh, did you work in the cute little coffee shops? And I was like, you could call them that. And then, Starbucks had electrical outlets, and you can sit there for hours, and they don't kick you out. So, and they have pancakes in France, which is weird.
Writing in France. Okay, next question. Yes. Can you do the microphone? It's just better for everyone.
My daughter has 2 books published in Canada for young women. How do you get a publisher, an agent in the US? How do you get this to a larger audience? How did you get found when we know that there are talented people who are submitting and being refused hundreds of times from large publishers? What was it about you? Was it luck? Did you know someone? How did you get found?
I'll start. When I finished my novel that was written just for me for escapist reasons, I put it all together, and I knew an agent, and I sent it to him, and I said, please tell me if this is garbage. And I gave it to him on a Friday, and he called me up on Monday and said, we need to do lunch. And I thought, oh, so he'll tell me it's garbage over lunch. So he sat down and said, I think you should switch careers, which completely blew me away. And I also was 24 years into a journalism career, and I hadn't even thought about switching careers. But then, as that 5:30 deadline hanging over me every night, I realized I could take control over my life, and I could start to report on the things that I wanted to report on, still do some journalism, still do some writing. So it was an appealing pitch to me. So that's how my transition happened. It was actually pretty quick. Courtney?
Well, I think today, in the way that the publishing market is set up, which you probably already know, you really do need an agent before you go to a publisher. You have to sort of have this middleman. It doesn't happen without it. Authors, maybe there's an exception out there, but for the most part, authors just don't go directly to a publisher. So the tricky part is finding that agent. I think that when you think about writing in any respect, and this applies to reviews, it applies to finding a publisher, think about when you sit around a table with 10 of your friends and you've all read the same book. Do you ever all say unanimously, we all felt the same way? Rarely. Usually one person loved it, another person hated it, 2 people only read half of it. It just depends. And I think it's the same with finding an agent. It's really a very subjective thing. I know people who've had their novels rejected by several agents, and then someone just sees something in that book, and it ends up going quite far. For me, I was very lucky. I interned at the Atlantic Monthly magazine when I was in college. It was at that time in Boston. And for a period of time while I was there, I got to work for the fiction editor because his assistant was out on maternity leave. And he was this incredibly brilliant man who I was completely terrified of. And so my job for him was pretty much just he didn't use a computer, so just to pretty much to type up his handwritten letters to people who had submitted short stories. And one day he asked me if I wrote myself, and I said, yes, I write short stories. And he said he'd be happy to look at some of them. So the next day, I ran into his office when he wasn't there and put them on the chair and ran away because I was so intimidated by him. And then several days later, I could hear him in his office sort of banging around, and I didn't know what was going on in there. It sounded like he was banging against the walls. And I went to lunch, and when I came back, he had written me this letter in response to my short stories. The reason he was banging against the walls was because he was taking down his old typewriter to type it to me because he couldn't ask me to type the letter to myself, of course. And it was just a very sweet, very kind letter, telling me to keep writing and so on and keep sending him things. So I kept sending him stories, and eventually another editor there read some of them as well and asked if she could send them to a young literary agent who was just starting out, who had also been an intern there. And that woman is still my agent now. It's been 12 years. So that's how I met my agent.
Go ahead. Indira.
I just want to take a minute to look at the alliteration. If I'm not mistaken, J. Courtney Sullivan worked for C. Michael Curtis.
Yes,
That's lovely. I too was a little bit lucky. In right out of college, I won a fellowship to the Fine Arts Work Center, which is right on Cape Cod in Provincetown, and you get, it's sort of like what I called back then, it was the outward bound of writing residencies. It's really, my parents called it a dungeon. They say it isn't, but they say they didn't say that, but they did. It was kind of a hardscrabble life. And I had a second fellowship there, and the judge for that was a poet who introduced me to his agent and an editor at the same time. So, and it all frightened me, so I also just ran away. And but then eventually I said yes, and so it sort of fell in my lap at the time. I think it was just a really good circumstances of being a new Asian American voice, and at the time. But then after it got accepted, I really freaked out. That's another story.
Yeah, I feel like my example is usually not very helpful, just because it has been also very sort of lucky. I had 1 year between college and doing my MFA at Iowa, and my second year in the fall, the program coordinator called me and she was like, "Do you have a car?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you have an agent?" And I said, "No." And she was like, "Go get this woman at the airport." So I went and picked her up, and agents would come to Iowa just sort of looking for fresh meat, and I'd never gone to meet with them. I didn't feel like I had anything to show them, and my dog was in the car and like kept getting in her face, and she was trying to pretend didn't bother her, and we just really got along, and I feel like that's also a key thing with an agent, is that it has to be someone you feel comfortable calling on the phone and who will call you back, and who shares your sensibility and sees what you're trying to do in your work. And just through total happenstance, this agent and I really clicked. And so she read my one finished story, and then she said, "Do you have any others?" And I said, "No." And so then some months later, when I graduated, I sent her stories, and she started sending them out to magazines, which gave us practice sort of working together editorially until I was done with my book, maybe a year later. But what Courtney said is true too. It's just a matter of taste. Like then when we sent it out to editors, which was now 3 years ago, looking for a publisher, we sent it to an editor who had sort of expressed interest in my work, who was very famous. We were all excited. And she had it by herself for a week, and we heard nothing. And then on the 8th day, my agent was like, "Okay, I'm going to send it out to other people." And on the 9th day, the original editor wrote and said, "I will buy Maggie's unwritten, unconceived of second novel on the condition that we bury seating arrangements in the basement and we never talk about it again." Wow. And we were like, "Oh God, what does that mean?" And then maybe half an hour later, my editor at Knopf emailed and was like, "Please don't sell this book to anyone else. I want it." So it's taste is taste, and it's also really, you're subject to the marketplace, and editors buy things they think will make money, and they don't buy things they don't think will. So it's also just what's trendy at the moment, what's doing well, and it can be incredibly frustrating. So,
Is there a Wikipedia for agents, or it's sort of like word of mouth? Where do you find out about them?
There's a directory.
Is it Publishers Marketplace?
No, Writers Market.
Writers Market?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a website, and it has contact info for every agent ever.
Or if you find a book that's similar to what you think you've written, if you look in the acknowledgments, often the author will thank their agent.
Thank you very much.
We're almost out of time, but I'm going to ask the one question that everybody hates because you've just finished this book, you're on book tour, and everybody says, "So what's next?" And you think, "Oh my gosh, I just finished this book." But I'll start, and then we'll just talk about what's next. I am in the process of finishing my third in the series of adventure romantic thrillers with John Sinclair and Cordelia Stapleton. And so the third book is I'm just about to dot the I's and cross the T's on that. Courtney.
We usually, when I have a novel come out, I'm about halfway through with my next novel, but I think this time I had a wedding and I just don't seem to have written another novel yet. So I'm probably going to, but I'm not sure yet what it will be. So that's exciting. That's a great teaser for you. Sorry, I have nothing to say.
We'll take our time reading this one. Indira.
I'm working on a book that involves a family tragedy and an old tragedy. And what I'm doing is taking some of the characters from As Sweet as Honey and using them to tell the story.
Oh, good, because I like them very much. Maggie.
I think I mentioned my second book comes out in April. It's called Astonish Me, and it's about a dancer in sort of the core of an American ballet theater, or New York City Ballet, who helps a Soviet star defect in the mid-'70s, and they have an affair and ends badly, and she stops dancing and has a family with another man, and they live in Southern California, and her son turns out to have a very serious talent for dance, so she gets sort of drawn back. And it's very different from seating arrangements. It's melodramatic, which makes me a little nervous.
So you see, there are happy endings for authors because they start another book. So thank you very much, Maggie Shipstead, for seating arrangements, Indira Ganesan, As Sweet as Honey, and J. Courtney Sullivan, the engagements. Thank you.